July 1st, 1900. Canadians were celebrating the first Dominion Day of the new century, while half a world away for the men of Strathcona's horse, Dominion Day promised to be just another day. Hot, tiring, dusty, and boring. But that was about to change for the worst.
We rose early this morning, washed, ate, saddled up, got ready to escort the column when it moved out. After an hour or so, we passed Smith's store north of Val Station, when we came under fire from Boers hiding near a farmhouse. My friend, Angus Jenkins of B Squadron, was hit. A bullet exploding 2 cartridges in his bandolier. Our artillery showed up and drove the Boers back with shrapnel, but poor Angus died. It's a sad day for all of us. Our first man killed in battle. It made us all think, I can tell you that. We buried Angus in the garden of a nearby farm.
To understand why Angus Jenkins from Red Deer, Alberta, died on that July morning, we need to go back in time to 1886 and the discovery of vast deposits of gold at Johannesburg in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal in southern Africa. Attracted by the lure of gold, men flocked to the Transvaal from all over the world. Faced with this sudden influx of foreigners, or Uitlanders, as they were called, President of the Transvaal, Paul Kruger, and his government, fearful of being swamped at election time, refused to grant the vote to these mostly English miners, merchants, and criminals who were attracted to the gold mines. Boer refusal to grant the vote was exploited by men like Cecil Rhodes, who, with an eye on the gold mines, openly advocated the expansion of the British Empire through the annexation of the Transvaal. Intransigence on both sides, coupled with an increase in the number of British troops on the Cape and Natal borders, paved the road to war. Finally, the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which had pledged its support for its fellow republic, felt that they had little choice but to launch a preemptive strike before Britain could build up an overwhelming force. On October 11th, 1899, Britain rejected a Boer ultimatum to withdraw its forces from the borders of the two republics, and Boer commandos invaded Natal. British public opinion held that the war would be over by Christmas, but they could not have been more wrong. When war finally ended nearly 3 years later, the British Army had, in the words of Rudyard Kipling, learnt no end of a lesson. That lesson began almost right away. Despite initially winning 2 minor battles, British forces soon found themselves besieged in Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. Then, in mid-December, at the battles of Stromberg, Maugersfontein, and Colenso, Britain suffered 3 stunning defeats in what became known as Black Week. Scenes such as these British prisoners arriving in Pretoria had perhaps the greatest effect on public morale in Britain. The British general in Natal, Sir Redvers Buller, determined to relieve Ladysmith despite his defeat at Colenso, redoubled his efforts to breach the Boer lines along the Tugela River. Mounting an attack after dark in their second attempt to relieve Ladysmith, British troops crossed the Tugela River and climbed to the top of a mountain known locally as Spion Kop, and dislodged a small Boer force guarding the heights. An early morning mist covered Spion Kop as the British, expecting a Boer counterattack, hastily tried to dig trenches in the hard, rocky ground. The evaporating mist soon revealed the horror of their predicament. Exposed to heavy fire from the Boer forces on 3 sides, the British suffered terrible casualties. They clung to their positions all day, but by nightfall, without food or water and low on ammunition, they retreated down the mountain and back across the Tugela River. Dawn the next day revealed to the Boers and British stretcher-bearers a most tragic scene. Hundreds of dead and wounded, both Boer and Briton, lay scattered all over the rocky summit. Worst of all were the shallow trenches choked with the bodies of over 300 British soldiers, victims of the deadly accuracy of Boer rifle fire and artillery. The hard rocky ground made it difficult to dig graves, so many of the trenches were turned into mass graves and covered with stones, which endure to this very day. Spion Kop is now a national monument to the fallen, both Boer and Briton, and is a poignant reminder of the heroism and tragedy of the war.
Spion Kop was a classic example of the incompetence of British military planners in the early stages of the war. They failed to carry out even the most rudimentary reconnaissance of the Boer positions, and they made few, if any, plans to support the attacking force with supplies or reinforcements. Buller's indecisiveness and the incompetence of many of his staff officers was compounded by his genuine concern for the welfare of the soldiers under his command, a very rare quality in a British general at that time. His abhorrence of heavy casualties, or the butcher's bill as he called it, led to a degree of caution that often ended up costing more lives than it actually saved. That Buller was a brave man was never in question. He won the Victoria Cross during the Zulu War in an action that took place 20 years previously and scarcely 100 kilometers away from where he now faced the Boers across the Tugela River. When General Buller was appointed to command the British Army in South Africa, he expressed his misgivings to the then Secretary of State for War, Lord Lansdowne. Buller said, "I feel I am more suited to be second in command and not the officer-in-chief command." At the time, he was quite right. Fortunately, in the months following Spion Kop, Buller overcame his lack of self-confidence, and in the battles that followed his relief of Ladysmith, proved time and again that he was indeed probably one of the best British generals in South Africa.
This bitter war in South Africa would soon involve Western Canada. On New Year's Eve in 1899, Queen Victoria herself, shocked by the losses of Black Week, said to the Canadian High Commissioner to Britain, Donald Smith, Lord Strathcona,
"Donald, we need a regiment of your Western Canadian Cowboys you tell us about to help us fight the Boers."
Strathcona knew exactly what Queen Victoria wanted and what the British Army in South Africa needed: a fast-moving, hard-riding regiment of Queens Cowboys who knew the art of concealment, who could shoot straight, and who could find their way across the vast open veldt of South Africa. The British needed scouts who could report on the movements of the Boers, save the columns from sudden ambush, and when called upon, could dismount and fight alongside the infantry. Lord Strathcona knew that Western Canada had just the men he was looking for. Following discussions with the Colonial Secretary, Lord Strathcona cabled Canadian Prime Minister Laurier offering to raise and equip at his own expense a regiment of mounted scouts for service in South Africa. His offer was accepted, and under the command of ex-Northwest Mounted Police officer Colonel Sam Steele, recruitment commenced. Named for its benefactor, Strathcona's horse had no problem recruiting 3 squadrons of mounted troopers, one in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, another in Alberta, and the third in British Columbia. Most of the officers came from the West, and many had served with the Northwest Mounted Police, adding greatly to the professional quality of the regiment. Traveling to Ottawa for a brief period of training, the Strathconas finally moved to Halifax, where on March 16, 1900, 28 officers, 512 men, and 599 horses embarked on the SS Monterey, bound for Cape Town, South Africa. Most Strathconas knew little or nothing of the Boers, though many must have wondered what awaited them in faraway South Africa. The Boers, too, knew nothing of Canada, though by war's end they would have an enduring respect for the big stirrups, as they came to call the Strathconas. Prior to the Canadians' arrival in South Africa, the Boer forces of the Transvaal and Orange Free State numbered between 50 and 60,000 men, though it is unlikely that more than 40,000 were ever in the field at any one time. Their numbers consisted simply of every able-bodied male between the ages of 16 and 60, and there were many both above and below those ages who also served. Each Boer provided his own horse and rifle and was loosely organized in locally raised commandos that ranged in size from 50 to 500 men. Their eccentric and often ragged dress belied one of the most flexible and highly proficient citizen militias of the day. Their natural skills with rifle and horse gave them a huge advantage over the British soldier, who was often badly led and mostly on foot. Awareness of the inevitability of war had prompted the Boer republics to purchase the most modern and efficient armaments of the day: the long-range Mauser rifle, the pom-pom, and the Long Tom, a 6-inch Creusot field gun, came as cruel surprises to the British soldier. The British, on the other hand, were experienced campaigners, well-disciplined, tenacious, and were in the very essence of the words professional soldiers. Fortunately for them, the red tunic had given way to khaki, and the single-shot Martini Henry rifle had been replaced by the magazine-fed Lee Enfield. But they were hampered by their reluctance to adapt to a style of warfare that was characterized by stealth and concealment. Bitter experience, however, is a hard teacher, and the outdated tactics of the British slowly gave way to improved fieldcraft, better use of artillery, and a growing force of mounted infantry. This is where the Strathconas came into their own.
Until the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War, the military experience of most British officers was confined to colonial wars, where the enemy usually carried spears. But the advent of the magazine bolt-action rifle with smokeless cartridges and a killing range in excess of 1,000 yards changed the face of battle. Armed with the latest German Mauser rifle, what more could a Boer marksman wish for? Accurate up to 1,500 yards, the Mauser was superior in many respects to the British Enfield. The British rifle, for example, had to be loaded by inserting one cartridge at a time into the magazine. The Mauser, by contrast, was loaded by inserting a clip containing 5 rounds into a receiver where, with one press of the thumb, 5 rounds were loaded immediately into the magazine. A close examination of photographs of the Boer forces of the time would reveal that many Boers did not carry the new Mauser, but instead preferred the older, single-shot Martini Henry rifle, which had been the standard Boer rifle for the past 25 years. Their choice was simply a personal preference for a rifle they were very familiar with and trusted implicitly. What the Martini Henry lacked in range of the newer rifles, it fired a heavy lead bullet twice the size of the Mauser or the Enfield, and ended up inflicting some of the most severe wounds that had to be treated by British battlefield surgeons.
The SS Monterey carrying the Strathcona sailed into Table Bay, Cape Town on April 10, 1900. Unfortunately, some 150 horses had died on the voyage, giving rise to a cruel joke that the regiment would be renamed Strathcona's Foot. The loss of the horses meant a month's delay for the Strathconas, who found themselves camped on the bleak, windswept common at Green Point while remounts were secured. At this time, an overly ambitious plan was approved by Lord Roberts, the recently appointed British Commander-in-Chief in South Africa. This plan called for a behind-the-lines raid through Swaziland to destroy the Boer railway bridge at Komatipoort on the Transvaal Portuguese East Africa border, cutting off the Boers' last link to the outside world. The Strathconas were detailed for this action, and Colonel Steele with B Squadron sailed for Kosi Bay in northern Zululand. However, while preparing to land through the surf at Kosi Bay, the plan was scrapped, as word was received that the Boers were aware of the venture. a very disappointed regiment returned to Durban.
Though never a sound military initiative, the plan to destroy the rail bridge at Komatipoort was supposedly developed in part by Sir Roger Casement. Roger Casement was the Irish nationalist hero who was hanged by the British government in 1916 for his part in planning the Dublin Easter Rising. However, in 1900, Casement was in Portuguese East Africa at the request of the British government to report on charges that arms were being smuggled to the Boer forces in the Transvaal through the port Lorenzo Marques. The complex nature of this man and his rumoured pro-Boer sympathies would have to make him a prime suspect when trying to identify the informant who tipped off the Boers.
Now ordered to join General Buller's Natal field force, the Strathconas travelled by train to Newcastle and then by horseback to Sandspruit, where they were joined by the Earl of Dundonald's Mounted Brigade. Working in conjunction with Thornycroft's Mounted Infantry and A Battery of the Royal Field Artillery, the Strathcona's task was to scout ahead and protect the flanks of the field force as it advanced up the railway line to Pretoria. As the Strathconas entered Standerton, a small town on the railway line, the Boers blew up the railway bridge over the Vaal River and set fire to a huge storage depot. Delayed while the railway was being repaired, the regiment was actively employed scouting the countryside for elusive Boer commandos. Skirmishes were common, and it was during one such encounter just north of this bridge, on July 1st, Dominion Day, that Trooper Angus Jenkins became the Strathcona's first battle casualty. Back in Canada, Lord Strathcona had recruited 50 men to serve as reinforcements and sent them out to South Africa. On their arrival in Durban, the reinforcements travelled by train to Standerton, where they set out on horseback to locate the Strathconas. For a small group such as this, contact with Boer forces was inevitable. An official dispatch of the time reads,
On July 5th, 1900, at Wolfspruit, a party of reinforcements for Strathcona's horse came into contact and was engaged at close quarters with a force of about 80 Boers. When the order was given to retire, a Sergeant Richardson rode back under very heavy crossfire, picked up a trooper whose horse had been shot and who was badly wounded, and rode with him out of fire. This act of gallantry was performed within 300 yards of the enemy, and Sergeant Richardson was himself riding a wounded horse. In recognition of this heroic act, Sergeant Arthur Richardson has received Britain's highest award for bravery, the Victoria Cross.
Even the Boers recognized his courage.
Dit was toe ek by Ben Viljoen se kommando was in die Standerton gebied dat ons eers die big stirrups gesien het. Ek het gehoor hulle was van Kanada af. Paar dae gelede het ons omtrent 40 van hulle in 'n hindelaag voorgelê. Hulle het rondgalop en wild weggejaag, maar nie voor ons 'n paar saals leeggemaak het nie. Ons wou party van die wat van hulle perde afgeval vang. Toe kom skielik die een groot stirrup teruggegalop en ten spyte van ons sware vuur een van die gewonde soldate opgetel het. Ons het vir hom geskreeu dat hy moet toegee, maar hy wil nie. En net selfs as hy perd getref is, gaan hy maar aan. Hy het aangehou en weggejaag. Daar was 'n vreeslike geskiet, maar ek dink nie een van ons wou 'n dapper man doodskiet. Ek was bly toe hy uiteindelik weggekom het. Baie bly. Hy was 'n baie dapper man.
As British forces struggled to gain control of the countryside, the Strathconas spent the rest of July escorting wagon convoys and patrolling the railway line to Heidelberg. Frequent skirmishes with small groups of Boers kept them alert, but Steele was anxious that they resume their prime function as scouts for an advancing army. He was soon to get his wish. In early August, the regiment was ordered to Kop, this lonely hill located on the railway line between Standerton and Volksrust. Here, General Buller was assembling a large force ordered to advance north to cut the railway line to Portuguese East Africa, the Boers' last link to the outside world. In conjunction with this move, Lord Roberts would lead a coordinated attack eastward from Pretoria to link up with Buller near the town of Belfast. Scouting ahead of General Buller's advancing force, the Strathconas, under heavy fire from retreating Boers, entered and occupied the town of Amersfoort. As they were far in advance of the main column and their supplies, the men spent a cold and hungry night bivouacked in the town square of Amersfoort, seen here exactly 100 years later. The advance towards Belfast continued, and on August 14th, the Strathconas entered the town of Carolina. While moving up this road, they were surprised with heavy rifle fire from a small Boer rearguard hidden in the houses and behind stone garden walls. A determined attack by the Canadians dislodged the Boers, who, withdrawing to their horses, which were tethered in front of this hotel, galloped off to the north.
The Strathconas were well in advance of the main column, and they wouldn't have been able to hold Carolina on their own. The order was given to withdraw, and it was believed that there was a large Boer commando unit in the area. Unfortunately, there was 3 troopers that missed the order to withdraw, and they found themselves alone in the town with an increasingly large number of armed townspeople around them. Trying to bluff their way out, they said they were part of a much larger organization just on the outskirts of town. Well, the ruse worked, and it's recorded that early the next morning the 3 troopers quickly left town.
Reaching the vicinity of Belfast, General Buller joined with a column from the force led by Lord Roberts and, advancing east, attacked a large Boer force, commanded by General Louis Botha at Bergendal, fighting one of the last major battles of the war. This monument, which commemorates the Battle of Bergendal, is seen from the position which was held by Strathcona's horse during the action. The monument stands on the rocky outcrop that was the pivotal position in the Boer defenses. The Boers, after a heroic stand, gave way before the superior forces arrayed against them and withdrew eastwards into the mountains. On September 1st, Lord Roberts, now wishing to capture the town of Lydenburg, planned a 2-pronged attack with General Hamilton taking the Dullstrom Road and General Buller the Batfontein Road. A large commando under Boer General Louis Botha held the high ground and, amply supported by artillery, effectively blocked General Buller's advance on Lydenburg. Scouting ahead, the Strathconas drew such heavy fire that they were forced to shelter in this gully until nightfall allowed a safe withdrawal to Batfontein. Faced with this strong opposition, Buller decided to wait for Hamilton's flanking move to dislodge the Boers from the heights. To secure the column's camp, which was located near this conical kopje, Steele was ordered to re-establish outposts on a high rocky ridge to the right of the camp. The previous day, an officious staff officer had ordered Steele to withdraw the outposts, an error which was to cost the Strathconas dearly. Detailed to re-establish one of the outposts, a Sergeant Logan and 4 troopers began the climb up the ridge. When nearing the crest, they suddenly encountered a strong Boer force. After a fierce exchange of fire, Sergeant Logan and 3 of the troopers were killed, and the 4th seriously wounded. A Lieutenant Kirkpatrick, leading a troop further to Logan's right, also encountered Boers who drove them from the ridge, but not before a Sergeant Brothers and another trooper were killed. On September 3rd, 1900, 6 Canadians were killed on what was the worst day of casualties for the Strathconas in South Africa. all died in a vain effort to retake a ridge that had been in their possession the previous day. The next morning, it took an attack by 2 British infantry battalions to retake the ridge. Today, the 2 sergeants and 4 troopers lie in this little cemetery at Botfontein, facing the ridge where they made the ultimate sacrifice. General Hamilton's flanking attack eventually forced the Boers from the heights, and on September 7th, General Buller's column was able to enter Lydenburg. Continuing his advance, Buller pursued Botha's command over Long Tom's Pass, named after the Boers' famous 6-inch Creusot field gun. Finally reaching Spitzkop, at the foot of the pass, the Strathconas set up camp alongside a clear stream in this pleasant meadow and enjoyed a much-needed rest and an opportunity to secure fresh horses.
The area around Spitzkop was rich in small gold deposits, and the countryside was dotted with many of the small mines. Many of the Strathconas who came into that area had mining operation experience from British Columbia, and it took no time at all for those soldiers to get those mines up and working. Well, this endeavor quickly came to the attention of the Provost Marshal with the main column, and he quickly had some of the junior officers, non-commissioned officers, and men in front of General Buller for looting. Well, General Buller was a very benevolent man, and he quickly reprimanded the soldiers and told them that they had to turn in any gold that they had taken. Some of the gold was turned in, however, it's rumored that some of the gold might have made its way back to Canada.
On September 25th, General Buller resumed his advance, driving a strong Boer rearguard from the precipitous Burgers Pass and the area around the Macmac Falls, thereby opening the road to Pilgrim's Rest. As advance guard, the Strathconas were in the forefront of the action, and by nightfall on September 27th, they entered the gold mining town of Pilgrim's Rest. Today, the town is a tourist attraction, preserved much the way it was when the Strathconas rode in 100 years ago. To many on the British side, it seemed that the war was almost over. President Kruger had gone into exile in Europe, Boer forces were scattered, and most towns, including the capitals of both Boer republics, were occupied by British forces. Following the disbandment of Buller's field force, the Strathconas began the long return march to Lydenburg and then on to Machadodorp, rejoining the main railway line. Here, General Buller, who was returning to England, took his leave of the regiment. In his farewell address, he thanked the Strathconas for their devotion to duty and added,
"I have never served with a nobler, braver, or more serviceable body of men."
General Buller sailed for England and a hero's welcome, at least from the British public. The British government, for its part, influenced though by his detractors in the army, was less than welcoming. When Lord Roberts returned to England a few months later, he received an earldom, a gratuity of £100,000, which was a huge fortune in those days, and he was appointed to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the army. Buller received nothing. It was Buller's misfortune to be remembered mostly for his initial failures at Colenso and Spion Kop, and not for his latest successes, which included the relief of Ladysmith and his defeat of the Boer forces under General Botha at Bergendal. The one aspect of Buller's military career that will always overshadow any criticism was the enduring respect and affection he was shown by ordinary soldiers who served under him. Eventually he retired, and in 1905, 3 years before his death, a statue of Buller on his horse was erected in the city of Exeter, an honour unprecedented in England for a living general.
Arriving by train in Pretoria, the off-duty Strathconas visited the former home of the Boer president Paul Kruger, who was now in exile in Europe. They also visited the Raadsaal, or town hall, which had served as the seat of government of the Transvaal Republic. Relaxing in the capital, many troopers thought the war was over and expected an early return to Canada. But the war was far from over. Boer commandos, under the firm and skilled leadership of men like De Wet, De la Rey, and Botha, realizing they could not hope to defeat the British Army in open battle, adopted guerrilla warfare tactics. Using their skills of mobility and concealment, they split up into small groups which harried the British troops, captured trains, and when a weak garrison was discovered, united to attack in force. On October 22nd, just such an opportunity presented itself to the Boers in the village of Frederickstad, west of Johannesburg. A column led by General Barton was attacked and besieged by Boer General Christian de Wet's commando and was in serious trouble. A scratch force under the command of Colonel Hicks was hastily assembled and, led by the Strathconas, marched to the relief of Frederickstad. A coordinated attack by Barton and Hicks drove the Boers from their positions in a deep gully astride the railway bridge. Trooper Edwin McCormick, a 15-year-old bugler with the Strathconas, while walking over the battlefield after the action, came across the dead bodies of both friend and foe. In his memoirs, he tells of one instance he would never forget.
I saw a boy, younger than I. Fine-looking boy, perhaps about 13 years old. His blue eyes wide open, looking into the sun. His shirt was open and a swarm of flies covered his bloody intestines oozing from a hole in his navel. I wept as I stood there swishing away the flies. I was glad he carried no rifle and had no part in the battle. Close by lay another dead Boer, his Mauser rifle beside him. His arm was stretched out towards the boy. I believe it was his father.
This tragic scene would remain with McCormick all his life. This is the railway bridge around which the Battle of Frederickstad was fought in 1900. Today, the small village no longer exists, and the peace is broken only by the singing of birds. The Strathconas remained in the area of Frederickstad and the nearby town of Potchefstroom for close to a month. Their time was spent patrolling the countryside, searching out the small Boer commandos that caused havoc with their train-wrecking activities. Boer guerrilla warfare tactics had caught the British by surprise, and their many successes were proving an embarrassment to the British High Command, who had been claiming that the Boers were finished and the war was all but over. Desperate to regain the initiative, the new British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Kitchener, implemented an extensive system of blockhouses to guard the vulnerable railway lines. These small stone or iron forts were erected within rifle shot of each other and connected with formidable barbed wire entanglements. The partial success of his blockhouses in defeating the Boer specialty of train wrecking encouraged Kitchener to expand the system by using lines of blockhouses to divide the countryside into contained areas, which he thought could be easily swept of Boers by mobile infantry columns. This left one problem to be attended to: the Boer women and children who ran the farms while their husbands or fathers were away fighting, and who provided food, encouragement, and information to the commandos. Kitchener's solution was simple. British troops would burn the farms, capture or slaughter all the livestock, destroy the crops, and remove the women and children to places of confinement, ominously called concentration camps. Many of the Strathconas were of farming stock, and the notion of destroying a man's farm, no matter the reason, was inherently distasteful. The regimental diary records that
the work did not suit the men at all. The cries and lamentations of the women and children had a most depressing effect upon them. It would be useless to keep such a regiment employed in this way.
Fortunately, fate in the form of General de Wet would intervene. On November 27th, this redoubtable Boer general captured the British garrison at De Wetsdorp in the Orange Free State. This prompted the hurried dispatch of General Knox at the head of 3 columns of infantry and artillery in pursuit of De Wet. To the relief of the Strathconas, they were ordered to join Knox's force, and by the start of December, they were deep in the Orange Free State, hot on the heels of this elusive Boer general and his commando.
General De Wet is a legend in Afrikaner history. He was the son of the Free State, born near the town of De Wetsdorp, which was named after his father. His strong, forceful personality had a positive impact on the morale of his men, though he was not adverse to using his riding whip to enforce discipline. After the fall of Bloemfontein, he was largely responsible for a change in Boer tactics, which saw increasing attacks against British lines of communication. In this, General De Wet was without equal.
De Wet's superior mobility and his knowledge of the country stood him in good stead, enabling him to slip through the gaps in the pursuing columns and disappear into the vast mountainous landscape of the eastern Orange Free State. Knox's force was at least able to deflect De Wet from his stated objective of invading the Cape Colony, but to the frustration of Steele and his officers, proved time and again to lack the necessary initiative and drive to corner De Wet. To Kitchener's dismay, De Wet's growing fame as a Boer general they couldn't catch was spreading around the world. A popular story of the time had a London newspaper publishing a photo of De Wet in its evening edition. Readers turning to the page saw only a blank space with the caption, "This is typical of De Wet. He is never where you expect him to be." The arrival of Christmas 1901 saw the Strathconas in the Maluti Mountains, near the border of Basutoland, still in pursuit of De Wet. An occasional encounter with his rearguard would result in a short, sharp skirmish, reminding the Canadians of the dangerous nature of the man they were hunting.
It's De Wet. He's quite a fellow. He can take his men up the steepest mountain pass on the darkest night, often in the pouring rain, and just be gone by morning. He can hide out in a valley so small you would never look for 50 men there, let alone 1,000, and let you pass by without making a sound. But just make one mistake. Split a column in 2 across a river, or send out a wagon convoy with too small an escort, and De Wet will find you. I know we're hunting De Wet, but sometimes I think he's hunting us.
Trooper Ingram was killed scouting a ridge near Clocolan when his patrol encountered a small force from De Wet's commando. Today he rests peacefully in the Garden of Remembrance in Kroonstad. Ordered to Kroonstad, the Strathconas handed in their horses and surplus gear before boarding a train for Cape Town. It was January 1901, and their time in South Africa was up. Their war was over. And what of De Wet? De Wet would never be caught. He would die in 1926, a hero of the Boer republics. Today, he is celebrated throughout the Orange Free State with splendid statues and memorials, and lies buried at the foot of the monument to the Boer women and children in Bloemfontein. The war would drag on for another year and 5 months. In a desperate effort to destroy the commandos, Kitchener would build 8,000 blockhouses and employ nearly 500,000 British soldiers to pursue some 10,000 to 15,000 Boers. Over 30,000 Boer farms would be destroyed, and, in the greatest shame of the war, 26,000 Boer women and children would die in the concentration camps. Finally, on May 31st, 1902, The peace treaty of Vereeniging, which ended all hostilities, was signed by representatives of the Boer republics and the British government in Melrose House, Kitchener's residence in Pretoria. The Anglo-Boer War was finally over. On January 20th, 1901, the Strathconas arrived in Cape Town and, embarking on the SS Lake Erie, sailed for England that very afternoon. Lord Strathcona had arranged for the regiment to return to Canada via London so that he may have the opportunity to personally thank them for their service and for Her Majesty Queen Victoria to present their campaign medals. The Queen's death while the regiment was en route to England cast some gloom over the men, but this was soon dispelled by their tumultuous welcome in London. Crowds lined the streets as they marched to their barracks, accompanied by cheers of thousands of well-wishers who had turned out to greet the Canadians. On Friday, the 15th of February, Strathcona's horse paraded in front of the West Terrace of Buckingham Palace. Present on the terrace were Lord and Lady Strathcona, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, and many old friends of the regiment, including General Buller and the Earl of Dundonald. At noon, His Majesty King Edward VII appeared on the terrace and personally presented each man and officer with the Queen's South Africa Medal. The medal presentation concluded, the King presented to Colonel Steele and the regiment a king's colour, saying,
"It was the intention of my late mother to present you with this colour. I do so now, and ask you to guard it in her name and mine. Be assured that neither I nor the British nation will ever forget the valuable services you have rendered in South Africa."
Reminders of the war may still be found in villages, towns and cities right across the country. Names like Mafeking, Pretoria and Ladysmith were brought home to Canada and appear as street names, while in parks, mounted statues commemorate now forgotten heroes. A total of 7,368 Canadians served in South Africa. Of these, 89 were killed in action. 135 died of disease, and some 252 were wounded. Although many of them, as volunteers, went in search of adventure, they found instead in South Africa an oppressively hot and dry climate, rampant disease, and an elusive and dangerous enemy they seldom saw. No doubt, most were glad when their terms of service expired. But it is interesting to note that many went on to volunteer for the South African Constabulary, and many served well beyond the end of the war. The fighting in South Africa taught Canadian soldiers a number of valuable lessons. They developed a sense of confidence in their ability to function as an effective, independent military force, and they emerged with a new sense of national pride, which would later lay the foundation of today's modern Canadian Army.
The glamour gone, some scattered graves and memories dim remain, with his old pals across the veldt. He'll never trek again. But yet there's nothing he regrets as he awaits the final call. For what was done, or lost, or won, he did his bit. That's all.
Strathcona's horse returned to Canada, and on March the 9th, 1901, the regiment was disbanded. However, in 1909, that famous name, Strathcona's Horse, was reactivated, and A Squadron of the Royal Canadian Mounted Rifles were renamed Lord Strathcona's Horse Royal Canadians. Today, this regiment, with its rich Western heritage, proudly serves with Canada's Armed Forces.